In this lecture, we are going to continue looking at some of the security models you need for your exam. We are going to start out with the Clark-Wilson rule, which focuses on integrity. It separates the users from the backend data through what they call well-formed transactions and separation of duties. It uses subjects and objects that you are already familiar with, but it also uses a program which acts as an intermediary between the subjects and the objects. Clark-Wilson or something very like it is used in many places and in lots of applications. An easy way to remember it is think of buying something on Amazon. If I go buy a book, I can't go in and change how many books they have available. They allow me to add it to my cart, to pay for it, and then the intermediary program that Amazon has subtracts one from the inventory once I have purchased, or at least when they ship it. In reality, it is obviously way more complex than my example, but it is a good visual to see how the process works. The separation of duties that Clark-Wilson uses is the same one we have talked about already. We don't let Bob both issue a purchase order and then approve it. The same here, we do not let the same subject certify a transaction and then allow them to implement it. And then finally, for Clark-Wilson, let's talk about well-formed transactions. And here, really, the keywords are from one consistent state to another consistent state. Remember, it is integrity. When I place my order for that book, if they have 1,000 prior to me ordering, it should change to 999 and then wait for the next customer. From one consistent state to another consistent state. Now we have the Brewer-Nash model. If you look at some of the older books, you may see it referred to as the Chinese War model, but I don't think I've seen that phrase in the last 10 plus years. The only other one, other than Brewer-Nash, I have seen is information barriers. It's designed to provide controls to mitigate conflict of interest in commercial organizations, and it is built on an information flow model. No information can flow between subjects and objects that would create a conflict of interest. And we limit the access that subjects have to the objects based on that. Now let's take a look at the non-interference model. And the graphics over here on the right is for that model. The non-interference model is built to ensure that any action that takes place at a higher security level does not affect or interfere with actions taken at a lower level. It does not care about the data flow. Its only focus is on what a subject knows about the state of the system. Any changes made at a higher level should never be noticed by someone who has only access to a lower level. Each level of clearance is clearly siloed off from any other. And then now let's look at the take-grant protection model. The take-grant model uses rules that govern interactions between objects and subjects. And as the name indicates, you can take or grant permissions from other subjects. It has 4 rules. If we look at the graphics over here on the right, Thor can take Jane's rights to an object. Jane can grant her own rights to Bob, then she can create new rights, and she can remove her own rights over that object. In the real world, this is vastly more complex. For the exam, just walk through it a few times, go through the flow, and that should be enough. Looking at the access control matrix, the rights of every single subject is described in relation to every single object on the entire system. Think of this as a giant Excel spreadsheet. And rights are then assigned to the subjects for every object. Each row is unique to each subject. That is also called a capabilities list. What is that one subject able to do on those objects? And then the columns shows the ACLs, the access control lists, for each object or each application. If we look at the access control matrix over here on the right, for object number 1, Thor has read-writes only. Object number 2, Thor has read and write. And object number 3, I have full control. Jane has full control over object 1, read for object 2, and no access for object 3. In real environments, huge Excel spreadsheets. But you get the idea, right? Here, let's look at the segment framework and then finish this lecture out with security modes. We use the segment framework for enterprise architecture. We have the 6 frameworks: what, how, where, who, when, and why. Then we map those frameworks to the roles. Again, 6 roles: planner, owner, designer, builder, programmer, and user. So if we look over here on the right, the user, for them, data needs to be what? It needs to be usable data. If we're on network, well then it needs to be usable network. If we look at the planner and the network, well then they need a list of our business locations. So for this framework, we need to understand the different roles, their needs, so we can give them what they need when they need it. And as the last part of this lecture, let's look at security modes. They can be both mandatory and discretionary access control. Here, the systems we are accessing contains different level of security classifications, and which security mode we choose to implement will be determined by the users, who will directly or indirectly be accessing the system, the types of data on the system, both the classification levels, compartments, and categories of things that we are processing on the system. We also take into consideration what types of users we have on the system, their need to know, and if we have formal access approval in place for those users. As we start going through these modes, you will see many of them look very similar, but they all have distinct differences. So let's start out with dedicated security mode. Here, all users on a system must have signed an NDA for all information on that system, proper clearance for all information on that system. You get the idea by now, right? Formal access approval, a valid need to know for all data on that one system. Since everybody on that system has signed the NDA, have proper clearance, formal access approval, and need to know, well then everybody can access everything on that system. Then we have system high security mode. Here again, it is all users must have the NDA for all information, proper clearance for all information, formal access approval for all information. The difference here is they have a valid need to know for some of the information, which means they can access the things where they have a need to know, nothing else. But they still have the NDA, the clearance, the formal access approval for all the things on the system. And as the last 2 security modes, we have compartmented and multi-level security mode. Again, everybody has the signed NDA and the proper clearance for everything on the system, but they only have the formal access approval, the need to know for some of the information. So what they can access depends on their need to know and their formal access approval. And lastly, multi-level. Here again, we have the signed NDA for everything, but they only have the proper clearance for some of the data. They have formal access approval for some. They have valid need to know for some. So their access to the data is based on their need to know, their clearance, and the formal access approval. Most students, after we go through all these, kind of just shake their heads and say, I will never, ever remember this. Because they are so similar and it's just tiny differences. Some ask, do I really need to know this for the exam? And my answer is yes. Everything I teach you need to know for the exam. That said, not all knowledge is created equally. When I was studying for my exam, there were areas I chose to ignore, but that is a calculated risk. If you ignore one area of one domain, well, then you need to do better on the rest to pass the exam. I knew what I was chancing, but I only had a couple of weeks left for my exam. I knew if I chose to spend those 2 weeks on the areas where I wouldn't see much improvement, well, then maybe I would get a 1 or 2% higher score. Or I could use my energy in other areas that I knew were heavy on the exam and maybe get 5 or 10% improvement. So I focused on the areas that I knew were important. In the perfect world, of course, we have enough time for everything. But at some point, you need to pick the right battles. Focus your energy where it is going to give you the best results, the most return on investment, just like anything else we do on the exam. And do this at your own discretion. You know where your weak areas are. You know which areas can give you the biggest benefit for the least amount of time invested. And then a warning. Do not take this as me saying it is okay for you to skip a knowledge area. It is not. What I am saying is for you to focus your energy where it matters and not bang your head against the wall on a concept that you are having problems understanding. Use your energy where it matters and maybe revisit the topics that you are having a hard time with later. And let's finish this lecture out with a little trick. Look at the names of the different security modes. Multi-level, it has multiple levels. That is multiple level of clearance. Compartmented security mode, think of this as different compartments on the system. System high, everybody has the clearance, the formal access approval. It is high security, and then they can access the data on a need to know. And then finally, dedicated. Think of this as a dedicated system. It is dedicated to people who have everything they need to access all the data. I hope those help you differentiate the 4 different modes. And with that, we are done with this lecture. I will see you in the next one.